Right, my friend. Good to have you here, Izzedin. And thank you. It's been in quite a while. I've been wanting to have this conversation with you. I know this is just the beginning of many more, and I can't thank you enough for availing of your time to chat with me. Yesterday, we had a Black History Month event, and at that event, I made a presentation on the idea of home and belonging. And I think this will basically be the theme of our conversation today. And before we get into it proper, Izzedin, maybe you want to give us a little background of who you are. I know that question, who are you, is not one that we can exhaust here, but just briefly to introduce yourself.
Well, Assalamu alaikum, Brother Benjamin, and thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you. I am Izzedin Hawamda. I am a Palestinian living in Canada on Turtle Island. I'm originally from the West Bank, from a city called Nablus in the heart of the West Bank, and that's where my family lives and have always lived. I love this notion of home and belonging. The Palestinians have been trying to answer that question for a long time now. And for the past 15 months, it's been a very difficult time for the world, and particularly for Palestinians, as we watched people in Gaza lose their homes and lives and livelihoods, and have been made to be or have been made displaced not once or twice, more than that. As a Palestinian who lives in Canada, I aim at talking about home, belonging, but also about mourning as a resistance, grievance as resistance. And so I'm happy to be with you today, and I'm happy to explore some of those notions.
Thank you so much, Izzedin. I mean, we live in a very much hostile political climate at the moment. I teach political science, and whenever I go into the classroom, sometimes it feels really hopeless. It feels hopeless, the kinds of things that we study in the class, because these are things that concern, human beings, human people elsewhere. We discuss issues of war and conflict, issues of the global political economy, and we have seen increasingly, especially with Trump coming to power, some of the changes we're experiencing in these areas. And more so, even when we talk about war, you had mentioned that you grew up in the West Bank. And every day you put on the news, regardless what news channel, you see the horrendous, dastard acts of mass atrocities, going on in the West Bank, in Gaza. And I just wondered, maybe before, because the image that people see basically is the image of atrocities. But if you could take us back briefly on growing up in the West Bank and how that was for you.
Thank you, Ben. I think my work tries to balance the two narratives here. My storytelling work and my PhD work as an academic as well, I aim at showcasing the human face of the Palestinian story in every possible way. I run events like the one I did yesterday, and I shared stories of my grandmother and mother. The one narrative that is very well known to the West, particularly about the Palestinian, it is that occupied narrative. And I always say we're actually way beyond that. We are very multiple. And so growing up in the West Bank, I grew up in a beautiful, loving family, a very extended family, a family that keeps growing. We're probably about 40 to 50 people. We grew up on our land. We have taken care of olive trees for generations. And those olive trees have become our mothers. The tree that you're looking at on the screen here has been there before the Romans. And so our land reflects us, and we reflect that land. And despite this notion or this phenomenon of the other that the Muslims and Arabs particularly find themselves within, we are people who love life. We are people who are we love our communities. We promote humanization. We eat together. We invite people to come and eat with us. And so growing up in the West Bank, despite the tear gas, despite the occupation, despite the barriers and the checkpoints, My communities have always been there for one another. In Palestine, we have this notion of raising children collectively. And so a lot of mothers and grandmothers raise children for neighbors and neighbors' children and so on. And so for me, I remember having so many mothers, if you will, and so many aunts and so many grandmothers that took care of me and helped me become who I am today. And so what I try to do through my work is to create spaces for mourning, grieving, and so on, but also spaces for resiliency and sharing of humanization through the Palestinian narrative. Lastly, I say that we as Palestinians share some of our stories through this notion of collective memory, in which we tell stories to each other in every way we can. We tell stories at the checkpoint. We tell stories while we are waiting to enter cities or refugee camps. We tell stories in the taxis while we are held up for hours at checkpoints. We tell stories because, as occupied people, if we stop telling stories, we gasp for air.
Wow, that is quite a deep imagery. I really wanted to ask about your background, picture there when you were talking about the olive trees, but you kind of mentioned it. This is nothing compared my own story, but as you were talking about growing up despite, and I would even say in spite of or even because of the checkpoints, because of the occupation, that people were still thriving, people were still exchanging hands of goodwill to each other and living collectively as a community. I was thinking of my own upbringing in northern Nigeria. The single story about that part of the world or the country is that it is always ravaged by religious crisis. And when you mention that you are from this part of Nigeria, people start mentioning Boko Haram. People would mention, farmer herders crisis. People would mention religious crisis. What they don't see is this everyday demonstration of positive encounters, that people, ordinary people, carry out in their day-to-day activities. So people don't see that. They don't see, even in the context of war and conflict, that people reach out to each other and support and help. And so as you were talking, I was just thinking about my own upbringing as well. What was it like living this beautiful land, to Turtle Island?
Living on Turtle Island here in Canada is a complex story in itself. I mean, I'm a Palestinian from Palestine. I have indigenous roots to that land, and I know who I am. Here in Canada or on Turtle Island, I am described or called as a settler. And so what does it mean to be a settler on indigenous lands? And what are the responsibilities that come with that? And so I always wonder, and I open spaces for dialogue on this, as a Palestinian living here in Canada, how can I bridge the gap between my communities and the indigenous communities, for one? And also, how can I educate, if you will, or create spaces for education so my community understands the colonial history of this country? Of course, you may know this, and you know this, brother, that when we arrived here, we were told a romanticized story of Canada, a story that actually lacked a lot of evidence and truth. We were told that we have made it, we have finally arrived to the promised land. But no one talked to us about the history of indigenous communities on this land and the colonial history of this land. Nobody talked to us or told us about the residential history, the residential schools history, the 60 schools, the Indian Act, and so on. And so many of us didn't know. And we went on. If you start working as a refugee in Canada, you want to make ends meet. You don't have the opportunity to go to school and learn these things. I was lucky enough to go to school and receive education and meet indigenous community members and sit with them and learn alongside with them to truly know the histories of this land and what occurred here. and what continues to occur, by the way. And so for me, I've taken all of those notions, being away from my home, the notion of displacement, and also being here on this land, on indigenous people's lands, being untitled. I very often feel like I don't know who I am here. I don't know if I belong here. I am always looking for a home, if you will. And so between these two phenomenons, I am often wondering, how do I create this notion of multiplicity, if you will, and how do I exist within these dichotomies, and create meaningful change?
Yeah. All right. So you mentioned this sense of nervousness of belonging, if I would put it that way. You know, you're never really at home anywhere. You are traveling, you're on a journey, but you never get to arrive at the destination, if such a place actually exists. Some people would describe it as neither here nor there. There has been this memoir I read recently. It's called The Son of Elsewhere. You go back home, you feel detached, you feel lost, you feel dislocated from the land, from the people. You have changed, but also everything has changed in there. You come back here, you talk about the indigenous history here, the history of colonization that you also struggle to connect to, that you feel a sense of resistance to us, but also that you experience daily in your life, just by being here on a foreign land. Citizenship doesn't even give you that sense of, belonging. It doesn't make you feel that you are part of the club. How do you negotiate this nervousness of belonging in your life and work?
I don't know if there is an answer to that, Ben. I think the answer for me has been, or some of the answers, is to be with community, and to try to connect with people on the ground and sit with folks and eat with them and tell stories. But you are right. As a Palestinian, away from my land, now living in the West here, when I go back home, it's always my journey, and I've just written a story yesterday about how detailing the journey to the West Bank, crossing the Jordan River to the West Bank. And that journey is very complicated and very hard, because you have to go through the checkpoints and the military apparatuses to make it to the West Bank, controlled by Israel. But once you start to go through that journey, you feel a sense of guilt. That, look, I don't live this reality on a daily basis. Yes, I'm away from it. Not to say that the occupation doesn't impact me. It so does in every sense of the word, because I grew up in it and my family's there. But now that I'm not living there physically, when I go back, I feel like this heightened anxiety and shame and guilt that I'm not there with my community who experience these realities on a daily basis. Then you come back to Canada, and you're always having to find your footing. You're always having a struggle, whether it is in work or career-wise, academic settings, whatever. As a person of color, as a minority, as a Muslim, navigating colonial structures to find yourself, your voice and agency. And often, at least for me, for a very long time, I've just stayed quiet, silenced. I didn't know what I should feel. I don't know how to actualize these feelings, if you will. I didn't know what to do with those mixture of feelings. And so you become lost in so many ways. And lastly, here in Canada, you very often I'm viewed through this oppressed narrative, right? And so I have to get out of that and deconstruct that before I can even engage in any conversations with folks around me. And so how do I deconstruct the dehumanization of myself in a setting that there is clear power dynamic that exists within those settings, that I am always the disfranchised, or I don't hold those powers. And so as a visible minority who brings that history from my land onto this land here, I don't know how to navigate or then navigate the notion of having a voice even. What voices do I share? What stories do I share? Do I talk about my country, Palestine, or do I talk about my experiences here? And if I want to find a balance, even if I could, what does that balance look like? And what stories do I share? The stories of my pain and trauma and occupation, or stories of resiliency, community, and beauty?